Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary Jerome McGowan, and my co-host, Patrick Sean Barrow. Together, we are Triage Method.
You're actually a loser. Anyway, so in today's episode, we are going to discuss this. Effectively is going to be somewhat of a continuation on from the last episode we did on RPE, reps in reserve, and training to failure, because there is still more to discuss on that. Like, obviously, again, like, you're not getting the full discussion in whatever an hour and a half podcast. Like this stuff is better formulated in article format, but also that's a little bit of a harder method to digest, because you have to sit down, read the article, blah blah blah, do all that stuff that goes along with reading even, and thinking. So this is obviously just, background noise, really easy to be like, oh yeah, understand that, but there is more to the conversation, right? So what we're effectively going to discuss today is failure, what that actually means, what that actually looks like, and when you understand that, or why, when you understand that, you actually realize that most people have no fucking clue when they're discussing failure, right? And obviously, this then informs your training approach, which we've discussed in the last podcast, right? Well, not the last one, the podcast on RPE, reps in reserve, and training to failure, that kind of thing. So first of all, Gary, if I asked you to train to failure, what does that actually mean on a mechanistic level? Like, what's happening to stop us from performing another rep? Because obviously there's a lot going into this. And again, you'll see this even when people do it in the gym. There's the psychological aspect. There's the, we'll call it the nervous system aspect, the neurological aspect, if you will. And then there's obviously the muscular aspect. So there are a few variables intertwining into what failure actually is. But do you have a physiological definition of failure? Effectively it's intertwined with fatigue as well. But what are your thoughts? Like, if I said, how do you know if someone has reached failure on a physiological level? Is there something we can measure? Is there processes that go on? What's the crack?
Yeah, for me, it's sort of an operating definition of when someone can no longer produce the force that is required for them to meet the specific constraints of the exercise, and that's really important because you can always do more work. As in, like, it's not like your mitochondria are no longer able to produce ATP and everything's broken. Absolutely not. Like, that's not the case. It's that you're no longer able to produce the force that is required for you to move against resistance in the constraints of the exercise. So, for example, you've got point A and you've got point B, and the successful completion of a rep is defined when you move from point A to point B, and you fail when you can no longer complete that arbitrary range of motion. So it is a failure to produce sufficient force within the constraints of the exercise. So while we've got our point A and we've got our point B, we've also got basically other factors that are acting there, such as if you're doing a squat, then a better example would be something like a bicep curl, right? Because if you're doing a bicep curl and you've standardized your first 10 reps to keep your arms down by your side, and you get another rep, but you only get it by swinging back, jumping up onto your toes and throwing the weight up, then you have not met the criteria that I described of point A to point B within the constraints of the exercise, because the constraints of the exercise were the strict technique. So if you have to totally change your technique to move the weight from A to B, you've changed the constraints of the exercise, and hence, like, we're not no longer talking about the same thing. So we were talking about point A, point B within specific technical constraints of the exercise. For me,
Yeah,
that's the best way to think about it.
yeah, it's the best conceptual way to think about it. Especially considering that, like, you're never truly taxing, like fully taxing, like reaching failure with your nervous system. Like,
No.
that doesn't happen, right? And that's why I wanted to mention those things coming into this discussion, because people think there is some sort of magical, like, measurable thing that'd be like, oh, that's failure, right? When realistically, there is no clear definition unless you actually talk about the actual outcome, right? And that is the like movement itself that you're performing. You know, because your nervous system isn't reaching failure. You know, that would actually be catastrophic for you as an organism, right? Your muscles, like they're not really reaching failure, right? They are momentarily reaching failure, right? But even then, it's like, no, there's still more work that they could, like, even not involuntarily, voluntarily do. Like, for example, I always use, because it's very easy to conceptualize, like if you had, what are those flywheel machines, you know, like you effectively with those, you get as much as you give, right? And so if you were doing something like that, you could effectively keep going until pretty close to true whatever muscular failure, right? Because you can keep going until you can't give anymore, and it's only going to give as much as you give, you know. And the closest you could come to something like that in the gym is probably something like the Airdyne, maybe, like a fan belt bike, especially if you use something like the Rogue bike, which is atrocious. But probably closer in terms of a resistance training setting, probably the closest you can come to that is doing drop sets on a piece of kit that actually fits your muscle's ability to produce force throughout the entire contractile range, right? That's probably the closest you can come to actually getting to muscular failure. And again, you would see this because, again, say, again, you have a perfectly designed hack squat. It fits your quad's ability to produce force throughout the entire contractile range. It's the most perfectly designed piece of equipment ever, you know? It's beautiful, right? Say you do 5 plates per side on that, and you reach failure at 8 reps, say, right? Your muscles still have the ability to produce force. You know, they may not have the ability to produce force through that entire range with 5 plates aside, but they could do it with, you know, 4 plates on one side, 5 plates on the other, right? And you could keep doing that, just pulling off a plate and keep reaching failure points until you're at 0 plates per side, you know. And then you could keep going, step off that hack squat machine and do something like body weight squats, perhaps, you know. You might still have the ability to produce force like that. You also may still have the ability to produce force and say body weight squat. Actually, if we didn't have a perfectly designed resistance profile, you might, as we said in the last episode, be able to do like partial reps in that range of motion, you know. So you might do a drop set on, say, squats, which I probably wouldn't recommend, but say you did, like you could say you do 100 kilos. No, it's actually easier if you do 140 kilos, you do 8 reps of your high bar, full depth, perfect, whatever squat, and you reach failure at that point. You could effectively keep cutting the depth until you're basically just doing a little knee bend, right? And then you could pull off a plate per side, right? And then keep going. You've effectively just done a drop set and keep going. Start again. You're doing perfect full reps. And then again, you keep going until you're only doing this little knee bend. Then you pull off the plates per side, keep going until, again, you're just doing this little knee bend. You just keep reducing, doing partial range of motion. And then you pull off the final plate and you're left with just the bar. Keep going. Same thing again, partial range of motion. And then again, you get rid of the bar and it's just your body weight, and you keep going until you can't reduce your body weight anymore. Maybe you can. Maybe you fucking put a resistance band around yourself and off a fucking rack or something, and you take some of the load off your weight and you can keep going, right? So no one trains like that. Literally no one trains to absolute muscular failure, you know? Like, again, as I said, the closest you can come to it is perfectly designed machine for your ability to produce force throughout that range. And if you combine that with a drop set, you know, that's probably the closest you can come to fully reaching muscular failure, right? Would you agree with that, Gary?
Yeah, like especially on your own, like there are, if you're a personal trainer, like you can help your clients by doing very specific
I was going to get
spotting.
to the spotting and also the psychological stuff as well in a second. But for now, you agree that
Yes,
that's
sir.
probably the closest you can come to reaching failure. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So we're already starting to realize that even though people talk about failure or reaching failure in the gym, it's an arbitrary failure. They've preemptively defined the range that they want to complete, and then they're only stopping, or so they say, they're only stopping when they can't perform another rep, right? In that arbitrarily defined range, right? Again, like it's not, I say arbitrarily, but obviously the exercise that you're doing dictates the range that is available, and obviously combined with your body, etc. Right? So it is arbitrary to some extent, because again, you could start doing partial reps and get more reps, you know. But anyway, the next thing that we need to put onto that is the psychological, and this book goes into the environment that you're in, and obviously the way you approach training, because like the vast majority, and I would say 99.9% of people training are limited by their psychology, not their physiology, right? Like their body has far more to give, and it's their mind that stops them before their body stops them, right? And you can even see this in people who discuss training to failure, right? You can the clearest example of someone who doesn't train to failure is someone who thinks only the last rep matters, or rather only the last rep is hard, right? Because if you truly believe only the last rep is hard, I would probably put that at a 5 reps in reserve, right? Because if you're not finding the last 5 reps or so hard, obviously progressively harder as you get closer to less reps in reserve, then you're probably quite a bit away from failure, right? And this again informs the discussion around when people discuss reps in reserve or PE and failure, because you'll see people saying like, oh, RPE is stupid, or reps in reserve is stupid because, you know, it's you're not getting to that failure point, right? But or they say it's easy training, like it's just too easy. Yeah, like if you do like an RPE 8 or a rep or RIR, like reps in reserve 2, it's like all those sets must be easy. You know, that thought process clearly shows that that person has never reached failure, right? Because if you think that 2 reps in reserve is easy work, that means that you probably aren't trained to failure when you think you're training to failure, because those 8 reps, like when you get to that 8 rep, that means you've only 2 reps left in the tank, right? That means that that 8th rep is going to be hard, right? So if you think that, oh, I trained to failure and, you know, I got to my 8 reps, so you do train to failure at 8 reps and you're like, oh, that 8 rep was really hard, I would argue you probably have more reps in the tank, unless you also thought that rep 7 was hard, rep 6 was hard, and rep 5 was hard, you know? Because if you didn't think that, I'm sorry, but you probably have more reps left in the tank, right? And you're only stopping because it started to get a little bit too uncomfortable for you, right? So that, when you say that to people, it kind of upsets a lot of people when you question how hard they are training, because they're like, it's my badge of honor, I train to failure. But again, most people aren't, right? However, the converse of this is most people that use RPE or reps in reserve also aren't training close to failure. You know, most of them are literally going like, oh yeah, that's 2 reps in reserve. When you look at it, you're like, and that's 10 reps in reserve there. Like there was no, like, they weren't challenging reps, and they're like, oh yeah, but like I'm accumulating more volume at a lower RPE. And it's like, yeah, man, okay, that's fine. If you want to accumulate more volume at a lower RPE lower RPE. I always get them confused when I'm talking real fast, because I'm like, it's lower reps in reserve and higher RPE, and that's the equivalent, and then you have to like flip them to the opposite. Anyway, like, oh, I'm accumulating more volume at this lower RPE, but it's like, okay, well, to accumulate enough effective volume at that RPE, like it's so low that you'd have to be here all day. Like you have to do something like German volume training to make that effective, because those sets are so pissingly easy that it's actually disgusting. You know, it's like that's basically a warm-up set that you're calling a working set, you know? And again, there are times when this is appropriate, right? There are times, obviously, that makes sense to do. Like, again, it's not like, we're not saying you have to be the most intense motherfucker in the gym every single day that you go there, but you still have to be doing somewhat effective reps when you get to the gym, unless you want to accumulate reps slowly over time, and as a result get slower results over that time period, and so again, that must be taken into account. Like if you don't know what, like effectively what I'm saying is both people on either side of the argument make their argument for their case, and both of them fall into the fact of not actually knowing where failure is, having never actually gone to failure. Like you see this again, like I said, the people that say, oh, well, I only stopped on that 8 rep because it got hard. And it's like, you had like at least 4 reps in reserve there. And you also see it on the RPE reps in reserve guys and girls. And they are effectively like, oh yeah, I'm training at an RPE 8, I have 2 reps left in the tank. And you look at the set and it's like, mate, there's 10 reps there. That's not even close to 2 reps in reserve. That's not even close to the RPE you've assigned to that, And so that has to be taken into account as well. Like you have to realize that both sides of the argument are often talking past each other, because both sides of the argument are not talking about failure in a clearly defined manner. They're not actually discussing. If you don't get your internet sorted, and I swear to God, you are going to have to come up to Dublin every single weekend to do these.
It was going so perfectly, and then you just disappeared.
Anyway, the last thing I said was, so most people are talking past each other because they're not actually talking about failure. They're just talking about their arbitrarily defined, notion of failure, right? And again, we have to layer on top of this the fact that there are techniques that you can use in the gym. And as I said, the gym environment itself, the psychology going into that, does actually influence it, right? And it comes in 2 ways. Like reaching failure on your own, totally different experience than reaching failure with a well-versed training partner, right? Because they can give you a little spot in the right position of the contractile range that can then help you get past that little failure point that you would have reached, and actually then tax the muscles. Say, for example, you're doing something like a hack squat, and the bottom part of that range, the hack squat isn't that well designed, and overcoming inertia in that bottom part of the range, it's just terrible on your knees. You're not actually able to contract into that, right? And then giving you a little spot in that position to get you out of the hole effectively, you're actually able to get more volume, then more tension on your tissues through the top part of the range once they give you that little spot. Again, something like a leg extension as well, you might do the same. It's like really hard to get into that contracted position. As you're approaching the top, they give you a little spot towards the top. You're able to contract harder into that end range position there, So a well-versed spotter can also change the entire experience of failure, like they might be able to give you the spot in the exact point where you need it to allow you to then actually get a more fuller muscular failure, right? And also you have to layer onto the top of that the fact that having that environment, where you're training with a load of fucking savages who are just getting absolutely after it, that's a completely different experience than if you're training on your own in, a cold gym in your basement, like it's not the same experience as fucking having 4 absolutely massive lads shouting at you to get another rep, So again, like as I said at the start, they're like, when people talk about failure, like there are multiple things that go into it. The psychological aspect, again, like you got 4 lads shouting at you going, come on, another rep. That's obviously psychologically a lot different than you training hard in your gym, trying to imagine getting another rep, Also, again, like the neurological experience and muscular experience are actually different to different people discussing. Well, when they're discussing it, they're talking about different things, right? So do you have anything to add to that whole discussion, conversation, rant by me?
No, I guess the point is just to get that when we talk about failure, we're talking about it in a very kind of specific context that is somewhat limited. And I think you have to keep that in mind when you're listening to both popular discussions and when you're reading research papers, because You know, sometimes you read research papers about some of the study designs that were carried out, and it's like all these participants trained to failure, and you're thinking, there's not a hope that anyone carried out this program to failure. You know, for example, if someone is doing a heap of sets of squats to failure and they've only been given 60 seconds rest, you have to question that. You have to ask yourself, how on earth would this be reproducible, like in the real world? What would it look like if someone did that in the gym? Like, that does not seem likely. As in, if you do one set of squats to true failure, like you really crush yourself, like, man, I'd be on the floor for 10 minutes. And the stronger you are, the longer you're going to be on the floor after that, you know, because of the sheer energy demands that you put on your body. The stronger you get, the more muscle you have, etc. So there is some degree of, like, it just doesn't seem to match up some research with some real world applications. And on the other side of things, sometimes you see the opposite in some research studies. Like some researchers will actually, you know, publish, for example, videos that they've of their participants performing their training, and some of it, it's like, yeah, geez, like you're getting at it. You know, Christopher Barakat is a sports science researcher, and he published a video of one of his trainees who was going through a research study performing her set of squats to failure recently, and she did like 80 reps with something that I believe was projected to be like her 20 rep max. two reps in reserve, or like anyone. So I mean, that's a ridiculous thing that she may never reproduce in the gym again, you know? So I mean, if she was to go to the gym and do a set of 20 with that weight, she could do multiple sets. Like, are we going to call that 60 reps in reserve? Like, I think we just have to appreciate that there might be some error in terms of like how we quantify these things, how they play out in the real world, and how that then compares to what you read in research, because there's just some discrepancies in some research papers in terms of like study results from one study and results from another, that you have to ask yourself, like, what are the differences in the way that this was actually applied? But you don't need to really worry about that as an individual trying to make training decisions. You have to try to figure out like what is working for you. Are you progressing? Because I mean, we can say that you've never trained to failure. Let's say, you know, let's just say that all your sets are at 5 reps in reserve, but if you've been making consistent strength and hypertrophy progress, it's kind of hard to argue with you. You know, it's like, well, whatever you're doing is working. You know, you might be able to do something better, but you needn't necessarily change it. But on the other side of it, if you're the person who you stop every time a rep gets hard and you're potentially never getting anywhere near failure and you're making no progress, and you find that you have to do 30 sets for a given muscle group, it might be worth questioning, you know?
Yeah, this, first of all, just on the study design stuff, like the fact that some exercise researchers don't include videos in their papers, you know, even if it's just a link to the video they have of it, is actually reckless in my mind. Like, it's the most archaic system to use. Like, it's like this, the thing that you are measuring is completely dependent on how you did it, and then you're not telling us how you did it. You're just assuming that what I call a squat and what you call a squat, and what I call failure and what you call failure, are the same thing. Like, reckless, absolutely reckless in my mind. You know? So that should just be standardized. If there's a research paper, like Gary said, and you see that there's 90-second rest periods or 60-second rest periods, and they're supposedly having done a set of failure on something that is both muscularly and cardiovascularly intensive, like a squat, you know, I'm probably going to have to press X for doubt,
sure, bro.
you know. Like, it's very hard for me to believe that someone did that, even a beginner, you know, like it's reckless. But anyway, that's an aside. What did you say after that then?
I basically just said that, you know, you have to ask yourself how whatever you are doing is matching with your results in the real world.
Oh, yes. So the thing that you have to then consider then is that if you are training with a few reps in reserve, or you're saying now you're listening to this and you're going, maybe I actually don't know what true failure actually is. You know, eventually, if you are progressively overloading, like if you are, you know, slowly adding weight to the bar, you will eventually get to a point where your 8 rep max is actually your 8 rep max, you know, like even for the the individual you were saying there that was doing a set of, I think it was hack squats or squats, and they got 80 reps on, or 60 reps or whatever it was, with their projected 20 rep max. Like eventually, if they were consistently doing 20 rep squats or hack squats or whatever, and they were slowly adding weight to that, they would eventually get to the weight that was a true 20 rep max, So again, you might be thinking, oh, well, this is just, pedantic then, the whole argument, because eventually we will reach failure at some stage over your training career, assuming that you consistently go to the gym, which is the big thing. You have to then consider then that really, does it matter? But to some extent it does, because you could be getting better results in a shorter amount of time if you were training more effectively. And that's a bold claim for me to make, especially considering that you, as an individual listening to this, might never actually be training to failure, but also still getting good results, So it's a very hard thing to disentangle, right? And effectively, it all comes back down to asking yourself, are you progressing? Because you can't control the rate at which you progress. You can't control how you progress. You can only control the variables that go into making you progress, right? And if you're ticking the boxes and you're getting the outcome that you want in terms of like, oh yeah, I'm getting stronger, I'm building muscle, whatever the outcome is, then it's hard, like Gary said earlier on, to say that, oh, this would be a better way, Like if it's working, you're ticking the boxes, you're enjoying the process, that's kind of all there is to it. Whenever you read any research or listen to any discussion on this stuff, it's like, are the people making progress? Yes. Well, like, let them at it. It's pretty straightforward in that regard, right? I also just want to touch on, before we get into the rest of this discussion, which is kind of a discussion of how people generally program their failure training. The thing I want to discuss is technical failure, right? Because this is something that is probably more likely to be the failure point for most people than actually the nervous system, which it's just not happening, or the muscular system, or even the cardiovascular system, right? It's technical failure, right? And I'd like to say, first of all, that the way most people get around this is they modify the exercise in such a way, like intra-set, like during the set, they modify the exercise in such a way that they're actually performing a different exercise just so they don't actually reach technical failure, if that makes sense. Because they've actually reached technical failure, so they have to modify the set to perform a different exercise, and as a result, not train the same tissues, musculature, systems, whatever it is that they're trying to train. So you'll see this most easily in something like a squat, right? People will start out their squat, look like this beautiful high bar squat, really deep and everything. And then as the set progresses, they get muscular fatigue in one of the links in the chain that's, producing force. And all of a sudden that exercise will turn into something else. They'll start doing this kind of squat good morning hybrid. It's like, okay, well, the first few reps, your knees and your hips were shooting up at the exact same time. They were coming up together at the same rate. And now it's like your knees come up first and then your hip shoots up, and there's like this effectively technical failure, right? So most people are reaching technical failure, but avoiding that by actually just changing or modifying the exercise, right? And this is especially true of those, exercises that are more open in nature, in terms of you have more variability of movement around different joints, like you're able to modify your technique or move other joints to accommodate a modified technique. You wouldn't see this as much in something, again, using the squat example, you wouldn't see this as much as something like a hack squat, right? Where you're able to actually keep the body in a fixed position and the joints moving are always the same joints moving. Like obviously you can do stuff like you can shoot your hips off the hack squat platform, and like stuff like that. So what we have to realize is that there is another failure point in exercises that has nothing to do with the actual body. Like obviously it has to do with the body because it's the body that's doing the exercise, but it's actually the exercise itself that is limiting, right? And that becomes important because, you know, when you're designing an exercise, or rather when you're choosing an exercise for a given goal, like picking better exercises, while it is less important than a lot of people believe, it's also very important for the actual training effect to be effective, right? And what I mean by that is, like, again, there are going to be better exercises for a given goal, right? And I don't think that's a bold statement to make, right? Some people would disagree with that, and they'd be like, "Oh, it doesn't matter. Like, it's all going to train everything eventually." And to an extent, that's right. However, like if you are trying to truly maximize a certain outcome, there are better exercises for that outcome, or to allow you, or to facilitate achieving that outcome. You know, like again, we were discussing before this, which won't come out till Thursday. There are better ways to set out or set up your arm training, right? You can pick better exercises to get the result that you want, you know. However, that doesn't mean that you need to do that, especially if you are in the first 1 to 5, maybe 1 to 10 years of training, you know. Like you just need to get stronger, bigger, whatever, all around. However, there are ways you can choose your exercises to better accommodate the failure that you actually want, right? So if you can minimize stuff like technical breakdown, then you are going to tax the musculature, tissues, whatever that you want more effectively. You know, does that make sense, Gary?
Absolutely.
You know, so like again, like something like a squat, if you are using a squat to build big legs, right? And the only thing that ever gets sore from squats is your low back, or the only thing that ever fails in your squat is your back, you know, or your cardiorespiratory system, you know. It's like that's probably not the best exercise for you to develop big legs. You know what I mean? Like that's not to say that it's a bad exercise, which is what everyone automatically assumes if you all of a sudden say it's not the best exercise or the holy grail of exercises. People are like, "Oh, is it a bad exercise then?" It's like that's not what anyone is saying. Well, probably some people are, but what you're saying with that statement is there's probably better exercises for a given goal. Like if you're trying to use a squat to build your quads, and you perform a squat in some sort of, you know, low bar, very hip dominant manner, it's like that's probably not the best way for you to build your quads. And you might enjoy that. You might be like, all right, well, it fits my other goals of, you know, powerlifting or something. And it's like, all right, cool, let's have at it, you know. But if you're like, I want to choose the best exercise to fit my goals, which are to maximize the growth of my quads, there's probably better exercises that aren't going to be limited by other musculature in the chain of events that, you know, you have to use that exercise for, you know. So do you have anything to add onto that, Gary? Like how, like obviously if we're talking about failure, like, and we're talking about technical breakdown in certain exercises being the limiting factor, especially if it's technical breakdown that involves other musculature, like do we then say, okay, so if we're choosing exercises, we'll avoid those exercises, or do they still have merit?
I know. I think the key point here is that like there is no standardized like definition of failure that correlates basically perfectly across exercises, in that like there's going to be a different limiting factor in different exercises, in different repetition ranges, and at different points in the workout. And I think like you just have to keep that in mind. Like there's no perfect algorithm that can tell you like exactly when you should or when you shouldn't go to failure. And this is why keeping your head on and taking in sensory information in the gym is actually important, because like your subjective experience of exercise is really important. You know, if you are training a certain exercise over and over again, and it never seems to be that the target muscle is actually the limiting factor, then you have to question exactly what you're doing. You have to change something, you know. So it's leading to failure, something else is doing the work or contributing to a larger proportion of the work. And yeah, that's just that crossover between what you experience subjectively and what's on paper.
Fair. Right. So that hopefully just rounds out a bit more of the discussion we were discussing in the last longer episode, the last, whatever it is, I think it was episode 90, whatever. And this then brings us to our next point, which is a discussion around how people are actually setting up their training when we have this, we'll call it this dichotomy between people using like RPE or reps in reserve, and then people saying like, oh, I train to failure, right? Like the way most people are setting their training up when they discuss training to failure is a little bit different than what people who look at it actually think they are doing in terms of the whole training experience, right? So the first thing is, most people, when they're talking about training to failure, what they're effectively doing is some sort of reverse pyramid training, right? Effectively, like we'll say pyramid training is where you pyramid up in reps or pyramid down in reps, right? And pyramid up in weight, right? So it might look like you are going up. So say you start off, you do your first set, you do 15 reps, they're close to failure. The next set, you do 12 reps, they're close to failure. And then on your final set, you do 8 reps and they're close to failure, right? Now, people, especially in the 70s and stuff, they used to use that method. However, if you think about it logically, it becomes blatantly obvious that the higher rep work you do initially is probably going to limit the lower rep work that you do in your final set, right? So you do a hard set of 15, that's probably going to limit your ability to do a heavy set of 8, right? And given the fact that the set of 8 is heavier, and as a result, there's probably more of a potential for things to go wrong, because it's simply a heavier weight. Shouldn't be fearful of heavier weights, but the fact remains that, if you're doing sets of 15 with, 150 kilos on your squat, and you're doing sets of 8 with 200 kilos on your squat, you're like, I'd probably be more hesitant with 200 kilos on my back, especially considering I've just fatigued myself with the 150 kilos, So again, when you think about it, you're like, okay, so those fatiguing sets beforehand, probably not a great idea if I want to maximize my performance in the lower rep sets, right, that come after it, right? So then effectively what we get this reverse pyramid, right, where you do the exact opposite of that, where I should note as well, it's called a pyramid because people used to do stuff like they do 15 reps in their first set, 12 reps in the next set, then they do 8 reps in the next set, and then they would go back down. They would do 12 reps, and then they would do 15 reps, right? And so that's why it's a pyramid, right? So just to state that. Then what you see most people doing, especially when they discuss failure training, is they're effectively doing a reverse pyramid, right? So they'll do their heavy set first, and then they'll do their higher rep work after that, right? So that heavy set, generally, especially if you're discussing, which seems to be the case because it's especially a lot of British bodybuilders do it, probably because of Dorian Yates, probably because of JP as well. And the way most of them program it is they will do a heavy set of 5 to 8 reps, somewhere in that rep range. They might do a 5 rep set, they might do a 6 rep, they might have a range, 6 to 8 reps or whatever, but it's somewhere in that range, 5 to 8 reps. So heavy enough, something that is quite challenging for a set of 8, right? And then afterwards, they will do either 2 different methods. So we'll discuss both of them, but they will effectively then reverse pyramid. They'll come down, they'll reduce the weight, and they'll do either a higher rep set, right? So they might do train to failure at 8 reps, right? Or again, like we've said, failure, it's hard to define. It's esoteric in nature to an extent. But they train to failure at 8 reps, or what they call failure at 8 reps. And then they take a little break, 2, 3, 5 minutes, whatever. And then they're like, okay, my next set, I'm going to train to failure and aim to get 12 to 15 reps, sometimes they even go up as high as 20 reps, right? Some of them also do, again, the exact reverse pyramid as discussed there. They might train to failure at 8 reps. Then they might be like, okay, reduce the weight, blah, 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 wait the time. They do 12 reps, get to failure, or whatever, 12 to 15 reps, they get to failure. And then they might be like, again, whatever, wait the time, blah, 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 and then they might do another set of like 20 reps, and again, like train to failure there, right? So that's the first approach. They might do the exact opposite of pyramid training and effectively do low rep set, slightly higher rep set, slightly higher rep set again, all of them to failure. Now, there's a few benefits and cons to this, which we'll discuss in a second. But the second method, before we get into that, what you'll see people do is they'll do that heavy rep set, the train to failure on whatever, 8 reps, we'll say. And then after that, they'll reduce the weight. But what they'll bring in is some sort of RPE or reps in reserve type deal, right? So they'll train to failure, they'll do 8 reps, then they'll lower the weight, I don't know, we'll say just arbitrarily 10 to 15%, and then they'll do 1 to 3 sets of 8 reps at that slightly lower level, right? So they know where their true 8RM is because they just reached it, they literally just hit 8 rep max and they were like, oh yeah, that was failure. And then effectively what they're doing is reducing that to something like 85 to 90% of that 8 rep max and then doing sets of 8, right? So that would probably put them somewhere around the 1 to maybe 2 reps in reserve, right? And however, you have to also take into account the fact that they've already reached failure in that training, in that exercise, in that workout. So that 1 to 2 reps in reserve is probably skewed a little bit lower. So it's probably only 1 rep in reserve, if not just below failure. Maybe did half a rep in reserve for those subsequent sets, purely because they've reached failure already. So they're not able to perform as well as they would have if they hadn't reached failure. So they are the 2 ways that are commonly done for this reverse pyramid method, if you want to call it that, or when people are discussing training to failure, right? And the reason I want to clearly delineate that, because you often see people saying they train to failure and they're like, oh yeah, I train to failure and I do like 3 sets. And quite frankly, that's impossible, right? Like if you train to failure, well, it's not impossible, right? But there's some caveats to that. If you train to failure on your first set, you are not going to be able to perform as well on your second set, and especially not able to perform as well on your third set, right? The only way you can perform as well on all those sets is either 2 things. You take a very long period of rest, talking 5, 6, maybe 10 minutes, right? Or you didn't actually train to failure on your first set, right? Because if you do train to failure and you try to take a normal, we'll call it rest period of maybe whatever, 90 seconds to 2 minutes, right? So relatively normal rest period. You do your set of 8 on bench press, or say whatever, you do 100 kilos, set of 8, boom, you bang out your 8 reps. That 8 rep, that 6 rep was fucking, grinding up. 7 rep, oh, you're in bits. 8 rep, you just about got it. You're literally at the very brink. You're like, maybe if someone held a gun to my head, I could get a half a rep extra, right? But there was no way you could get another rep, right? Because again, if we're arbitrarily defining it as, failure is you're not able to produce force throughout that entire contractile range of A to B, because again, that's what most people are defining it as, then you're able to get maybe a half a rep, but you reach failure, right? Or at least momentary failure, right? There is no way in hell you're able to do that then again for another set after waiting only 2 minutes. What would happen then is you do your 8 reps, and then the next set you get 6 reps, right? And you're like, okay, cool. It's still in my 6 to 8 rep range that I had going for this, allocated to this workout. But then the next set after that, you're getting maybe 3 reps, So the only way you could actually do it is the only way you could actually get 3 sets of 8 is if you weren't actually training to failure, or you were taking 5 to 10 minute rest in between each of those sets. Would you agree with that, Gary?
Absolutely. Like it almost just becomes like a basic energy systems discussion, like at that point, like, because when you begin to train like all the way to failure, you're digging far deeper into the energy systems that are required. So if you're doing your first set, right, and you're absolutely going for it, you're feeling fresh, you're putting in all your effort, you're using up the initial bit of intracellular ATP that's there, right? So we've taken care of that. Then you start to use your creatine phosphate to generate more ATP, and then that begins to be depleted and takes time to actually regenerate. And when you're doing multiple sets, it's not going to keep regenerating. And then you start to dig into your local muscle glycogen stores, and that begins to get depleted. And as you begin to use that, you're starting to accumulate all of these different metabolites from running through basically anaerobic glycolysis. So you're producing lots of energy anaerobically. And as you begin to do all of that, basically like that can't keep up at the same level over and over and over again, set to set. It just doesn't work like that. So if you've done one set all the way to failure, it's fairly unlikely that you're going to be able to repeat that same load over and over again for multiple sets. So on a basic, predicting from the basics, it's unlikely that is going to be the case. And I don't think you see that very often in practice. Typically what you will see is that people will get very close to failure, and they might be close to it, and then they're kind of hyping themselves up maybe more for the latter sets, and they can kind of match their reps just about. But very rarely you're going to see someone truly hitting failure for multiple sets in a row.
Yeah. Again, I actually really like bringing it back to just the energy system stuff, because it actually becomes so obviously apparent when you look at it in that instant, especially if you've done anything, we'll say, athletic, you've done some running or whatever, people training to failure for multiple sets is effectively like saying, or people saying that, oh, they do train to failure for multiple sets, and it's quite clearly a possibility, is very much like saying that you are Usain Bolt and you do your fucking whatever 10-second run, whatever, 100 meter, isn't it? 100 meters in 10 seconds?
Yeah, 100 meters, 9.28 or something like that. Anyway.
That would be like him saying, oh yeah, I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to repeat it in 2 minutes. And then I'm going to wait another 2 minutes, and I'm going to do it again. There is no chance in hell. Not a fucking chance in hell. And he wouldn't even be able to do it his 9.2 second, which is equivalent to a max, which you're saying you're going to your 8 rep max. So it's a max, your best possible ability, And even if you say, okay, there's a little bit of variance either way, there's still no way he's doing 9.2 seconds or whatever it is, waits 2 minutes, and then goes, we'll say 9.3, he's still not doing that. It's probably 9.2 seconds. Oh, I have to go again. Okay, yeah, it's 11 seconds. Oh, I'll go again after 2 minutes. Oh yeah, it's 20 seconds. So if you put it in the context of just an energy system stuff, or again a sports modality, it becomes glaringly obvious that people aren't training to actual failure in the way that they're saying they're training to failure. Again, they're just getting to some hard reps, and maybe the bar speed slows down a little bit, and they're like, all right, that's it, I'm done. Or again, technical breakdown. That's probably the thing that actually occurs, rather than muscular or an energy systems thing fails. They'll do their bench press and they're not able to get into that bottom range of motion because they already really didn't really have control in that bottom range of motion, and they were just always using a little bit of bounce to get out of it, a little bit of pop off the chest. And as soon as they don't have the coordination to do that, because they're starting to get a little bit fatigued in those muscles, they're not able to use that little bit of pop off the chest, and all of a sudden they're as soon as they try to pop off, and it's oh my god, I have to actually use my muscles now. And it's okay, there's nothing there. But it's that was just a technical failure point. If you were doing something like a machine chest press that was perfectly designed to your range of motion, you would actually be able to do more. You would be able to produce force for longer, So again, as we said earlier on, you have to actually put the exercise into, you have to put the exercise into account when you're discussing this thing, because again, the experience of failure, if someone gave you a little tiny spot off the chest, maybe that's your weak point, we'll say, they give you a little tiny spot off that position where you're actually not in, an active range of motion, if you want to call it that, and they give you that little spot, and then you're able to produce force again. It's again, there's more reps there available to you. Again, if you wanted to go to true failure on your bench press, you might do something again, you do your bench press, then all of a sudden someone puts in a 1 board on your chest, a 1-inch board on your chest, you reach failure at that point. They put in a 2-inch board on your chest, reach failure at that point. They put a 3-inch board on your chest, reach failure at that point, and so on and so on. And that's again true muscular failure. But what really is failed is effectively technical breakdown. You're not able to move A to B, and that's what has caused failure, right? And again, you're definitely not able to do that for multiple sets. So anyone who does the same way for multiple sets, whether you believe it or not, you are using some sort of RPE or reps in reserve training. Well, you're using some sort of reps in reserve training, because RPE is you're actually assigning a rate of perceived exertion to that, or rating of perceived exertion to that. And whereas RIR, reps in reserve, it's like it's occurring whether you are tracking that or not, especially if you are doing multiple sets, right? So that's why I wanted to bring that up, because a lot of people will say that they are reaching failure and then doing multiple sets, which is just an impossibility, right? So that brings us back to why people are setting up their training in something like a reverse pyramid method, where they are reaching failure, or what they subjectively feel as failure, on 8 reps, then reducing the weight and doing it for, say, 12 reps or something like that, and it's actually a really good way of training, because they are, far enough away in their energy system use, if you want to call it that, or the motor unit recruitment, whatever, in that the experience of 8 reps, the subjective failure point at 8 reps versus the subjective failure point at, say, 15 reps, you would potentially be failing for different reasons. Say, for example, you fail in your whatever 5 to 8 rep range, and it's mainly a neurological thing. You're not actually able to coordinate the movement as well as you could when you're doing less than failure reps or whatever. Like you effectively reach technical breakdown. You're not able to go A to B, right? Whereas with your 12 to 15 rep range, the thing that's probably likely to limit you is more metabolic in nature. You might run out, I'm going to say quote unquote because we haven't said it, quote unquote, run out of metabolic fuel, for that 12 to 15 rep range. Or you might, reach a level of cell swelling where, acidosis is really kicked in as well. And those are the limiting factors, rather than your actual ability to coordinate the movement and contract the tissue. Would you agree with that, Gary?
Yes, sir.
So do you have anything to add on to that in terms of why it would make sense to do something like an 8 rep or 5 to 8 rep, and then something like a 12 to 15 rep?
Yeah, like I kind of wish I was more ideologically invested in one sort of structure, because it always sounds like I'm just saying, "Oh, yeah, do what you want." But I actually think both an approach that the kind of reverse pyramid style you're talking about can actually work really well. And I do it with some clients where you do have kind of a heavier set that they're more focused on at the beginning, and then they kind of back off and do some slightly lighter work. And that is, as you said, far enough away to make it a little different from an energy systems perspective, from a psychological perspective. So yeah, there's absolutely merit to that, and I think it can be a really advantageous approach, especially for people who are maybe they get a bit more pleasure out of getting that strength feeling in their hypertrophy training, where they're doing a little bit of low rep work. I think that first set is a really good opportunity to bring that in, and I take it to even more of an extreme sometimes with clients who have more of a strength bias goal. But let's say we're doing more volume work in the 6 to 12 range, but they still want to keep up their 1 rep max or keep it progressing. Sometimes I'll include like a heavy single or heavy triple at the start, which is essentially the exact same thing, still using some degree of reverse pyramid, where you are pyramiding up to a higher weight and then backing off. Having said that, I also think it can be an absolutely fine approach to do standard kind of pyramid or ascending weight training if you're leaving a bit more in the tank. So that's the only kind of caveat there, is that anytime I would program standard pyramid training, where you're going from a lighter weight, higher reps, to a heavier weight and lower reps. Anytime I'm doing that, basically what I would be aiming for is to also consider effort in that equation. So I would also have like an ascending effort scheme. So it could be something like you start off with 3 reps in reserve in your first set of 15, and then you have 2 reps in reserve in your set of 12, and then when you get to your set of 8 or whatever, that's when you do your 1 rep in reserve. So you're basically saving a bit of effort, because as you alluded to earlier, what I generally wouldn't want is someone to totally tax themselves with really high rep work and then go into a really heavy set of 5, something like that, or a heavy single, and I think that's the way a lot of people train when they first get into the gym, because they just don't know what weights to use, and they're just like, oh, I'm just going to see what I can do with every weight, and I'll stop when I can't lift anymore. So if you are using that structure, ascending effort is a good way of going about things, which is essentially the opposite of the reverse pyramid style structure. And I think both of those types of training approaches are really good from an adherence and a training enjoyment perspective. And I think that's why they are so widely used, as opposed to conventional straight set strategies. But at the same time, like, we don't really have any reason to believe that any one like set structure is better than the other. Anytime they've been studied, they basically lead to the same outcome. So it's like, okay, consider it within the art of programming more so than like a hard science of training. But if you are someone that just like, I'm just here to make progress, I don't really care what I do, doing conventional straight sets, 4 sets of 8, whatever, is absolutely fine as well. So yeah, basically you can use them all, but feel like, actually ask yourself, are there any supplementary goals to my goal of muscle hypertrophy? And I think if strength is a supplementary goal, adding in some heavier work in that reverse pyramid fashion is a really nice way of going about things. And similarly, if you know that you're really psychologically motivated and you feel like you can put a lot more into your workouts when you've got one set to focus on, I also think that's good rationale for that reverse pyramid type of approach.
And effectively, this comes back down to the whole process of training is to some extent arbitrary. And although people do become ideologically driven in this, it's probably not a great idea to become ideologically driven and realize that, there are tools available to you, and there's probably a better tool for a given job. Like we said in the last podcast in this discussion, some exercises are just going to be better for doing higher volumes of training at a lower RPE. If you do something lateral raises, it's not exactly the best exercise to be doing some sort of reverse pyramid training, trying to get a new 8 RM on your lateral raise. It's like it's probably not a great approach overall, right? So obviously the strategy you use is going to be dictated by the goal and then the exercise you use to achieve that goal, like what you have available to you. Like we were saying earlier on, if you have something like a hack squat that is perfectly designed and you're able to, produce force throughout the entire contractile range, that's obviously a different experience than if you do something like a squat, if you're choosing that. Like, so again, like the approaches that you use for that may be completely different then as a result, so to kind of bring this together in some sort of succinct manner, again, realize that training is arbitrary to some extent. You can use whatever tool you want to use. There are better tools for a given job, and you don't have to be ideologically driven. Just because your favorite Instagrammer, YouTuber, whatever uses like reverse pyramid training doesn't mean that you have to use that as a viable training modality, because all they're doing is managing their output so as to minimize fatigue so that they can get higher training volumes over time. And what I mean by that is they can progress the weight, or they can progress the amount of volume in a given workout to thus progress the amount of volume they can do in a given unit of time, week, month, whatever, right? Which, when we start discussing volume, this is where people get a very skewed representation of how people are training when they do some sort of reverse pyramid training, especially like bodybuilders and whatever, because effectively people will come from, say, an RPE, a reps in reserve type deal, and they're used to doing, say, 5 workouts or 5 exercises in a given workout, and be like, okay, cool. All I'm going to do to change over to this reverse pyramid method stuff is effectively, say they're doing 4 sets for those 5 exercises, right? So they're at that level. That's what, 20 sets, isn't it? And so in their workout, they're doing 20 sets, 5 exercises, 4 sets for each. And they're like, this is unreal. I'm just going to change this reverse pyramid style training because these people are telling me that it's the holy grail. It's perfect. And effectively all they've done is, they're training a little bit closer to failure, but now they're only doing 10 sets per workout. And they're thinking to themselves, man, wow, that actually was great. I cut down the amount of time I was spending in the gym. However, what you have to realize is two things. First of all, it likely isn't going to lead to you cutting down time in the gym, right? For two reasons, right? The first one being that if you train to failure, you're probably going to have to rest longer. So if you train to your 8-rep failure, again, we're doing this reverse pyramid method, train to your 8-rep failure, you're probably going to need to take 2 to 5 minutes before you're ready to go for that 12 to 15 rep set, right? So you're going to be resting more in the gym than if you were to do something like a reps in reserve style training. You agree with that, Gary?
Yep.
Yeah. So again, like if you're doing 2 reps in reserve all the time, you're able to pretty much manage, okay, I need to only take 2 minutes of rest in between those sets, right? You maybe even only need 90 seconds, again, depending on what the exercise is, right? You might even only need 60 seconds. I don't know, right? So you're doing that. You're like, okay, cool. I can accumulate that volume. I know exactly how much time that's going to take. I can have my rest periods managed, right? Whereas if you train to failure, you're probably going to need to take then 2 to 5 minutes of rest before you're ready to go for your next set, which obviously makes it somewhat hard to understand how much time to allocate to the gym as a whole. You know, you need to take into account that, you know, some days you might be only resting for 5 minutes. Some days you might be only resting for 2 minutes. Some days you might be resting for 10 minutes. It's just a bit more variable in terms of going from that 8-rep set to that 12-rep set, you know? So that has to be taken into account, right? And the second thing I wanted to mention on that is the fact that while people think that that's how you would transition from an RPE or reps in reserve style training program to something like a reverse pyramid or failure style training program, that's not actually what occurs, right? Because what you'll actually see people doing who are into like failure training or this reverse pyramid training is they will do more exercises, right? So they will probably still do that 20 sets, you know, they'll still get the 20 sets that you were getting while you were doing your 5 exercises for 4 sets at RPE 8, right? They'll still do the same overall volume of sets, right? But the way they'll do it is, rather than having like whatever, I don't know, we'll just say just whatever, they instead of doing 2 exercises for their quads in that workout, right, they're now doing 4 exercises for their quads, right, at 2 sets. So for example, you're doing 2 sets for your quads, or 2 exercises for your quads, both at 4 sets each, right? So you're getting 8 total sets in that workout for your quads. You know, you're doing something like a squat and a quad extension, just for example, right? You do that, you do your 4 sets of 8 or 4 sets at RPE 8, cool, grand, right? You know, you've got 8 hard sets in total in that workout, right? Whereas the people doing the reverse pyramid training, what people initially think all they have to do to transition from doing that to reverse pyramid training is go, okay, I'm just going to do the same squat and quad extension, except now I only have to do 2 sets of each of those for a total of 4 sets in that workout. But again, that's not how people who are doing reverse pyramid training are actually trained. What they do now instead is, rather than doing 2 exercises, they're now doing 4 exercises for 2 sets each, right? So it's still the same 8 sets of work that, you know, you were doing when you were doing your RPE or reps in reserve training, right? It's the same volume of sets, right? Those sets, are definitely taken closer to failure, because again, they're reaching muscular failure during those sets, right? Now, obviously you can see there's potentially some issues with that from a practical perspective, especially when we're considering the issue of time, right? Because again, we'll go for your leg training. You know, legs are generally a strong muscle group. If you go from doing your squats and your quad extensions, you know, and you go from doing those 2 exercises, which effectively only need 2 setup, like 2 units of time allocated to setting up those exercises, to going to a training program that now requires you to have 4 units of time allocated to setting up those exercises, you know, that potentially increases the amount of time that you spend in the gym, right? Because think about this. If you do, again, your squats and your quad extensions, right? Cool, right? You only have to load those 2 exercises. Quad extensions, fairly handy to load. It's like, boom, stick the pin in. Maybe you have plate loaded ones in your gym. Happy days, still loading only a few plates onto that. Like the quads aren't that strong, especially in an isolation style exercise like that, right? However, if you go now to doing 4 exercises, maybe you start off with your squats, right? But now you have to load them a little bit heavier, first of all, because again, like you're going closer to failure, you're using a heavier weight as a result. But now not only are you loading that bar up to do that, now you're going to go on to your leg press now, and you have to load the fucking 400 kilos that you have to use for your leg press. And again, that's maybe fucking 15 minutes just loading plates while you're kind of semi-warming up for that leg press, right? But now it's like, okay, cool, you do 2 sets on that. Now you have to get off that, unload all those weights, and now load them up onto, I don't know, the V squat or the hack squat that you have in your gym, and load that up. Maybe you get fucking 3 to 5 plates per side on that, do your 2 sets, unload all those weights, and then you move on to your quad extensions. And effectively you spent, 20, 30 minutes just loading and unloading plates in your gym time, So that it's something that seems like you would spend less time if you don't actually understand how most people are, allocating time to a reverse pyramid method, especially as like British bodybuilders are doing it. They might get the same total sets that you do, but it actually takes them more time in total to do those sets because they have to load and unload machines, right? And that might seem somewhat inconsequential and irrelevant, but especially if you're training on your own, and especially if you are trying to fit in an hour workout before you go to work or whatever, like that's a practical consideration that you must take into account, like actually setting up the machine itself, especially if you're in a busy gym as well. Like there's no reason that now that you have to set up this other machine and someone else is using it and you're like, all right, well, my workout structure overall is fucked, and it's also going to take me fucking 20 minutes now to unload their weights or help them unload their weights when they're finished, and then load up all my weights when I'm going to do it, so that is a practical consideration that you must take into account when you're discussing all of this, because you'll see this as well, like some of these, again, people that do reverse pyramid style training in the manner that we're describing, you'll see them when they post their workout time or whatever, maybe they're using like a Polar watch or a Garmin watch or an Apple watch or something to track the calories they expend in their workout, or it's just they're using it as some form of tracking, and their workout will take whatever 2 hours, and you look at on paper the amount of sets they do, you're like, how the fuck did that take two hours? But then you take into account it's like probably three quarters of that workout was spent loading and unloading plates, or recovering in between these heavy, intense, very close to failure or at failure sets. So while like on paper it seems like they're doing less work or it's a more efficient way of training, for a lot of people it's a very inefficient way of training when you could just do something like, okay, I'm going to pick 2 exercises, only load these exercises once, or twice in the workout, and again, use something like a reps in reserve or an RPE and just do more sets at that workout station,
Yep, I agree. Anytime you see G or H or I at a workout program, like you got to run, 'cause that just means there's just a hell of a lot of exercise in there, especially if you're, so what I mean there for people who don't know, like normally trainers will label exercises as like here's your A exercise, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And by the time you get to H, like, I mean, you're pretty much done by then. So that kind of circles back to the discussion that we were basically having earlier, and in the last podcast that's going to be out on Thursday, is basically like the quality of the work that you do is going to be less as you progress later on in the workout and as you progress towards later sets. So if you are, having this approach where you're doing a kind of a reverse pyramid type of approach, if I was going to use it, I would probably use it like more for a couple of exercises at the start maybe, and then maybe bunch up more sets for other exercises at the end that you're just kind of, you're getting them done. You're not still like swapping from exercise to exercise, because that could compromise adherence, enjoyment, etc. Like, if you're just doing 6 sets for arms, there's no point doing like 3 different exercises to get that done, or 4 sets or 5 sets, whatever. So that, again, these practical considerations, they're often forgotten, important to consider. You do have to consider your own gym environment. Some people just train in hotel gyms or GAA gyms, and they're trying to follow programs that are from people that are, follow in the elite gyms in London or in New York or wherever. And like, I'm from Kerry in Ireland, and like we don't have those types of gyms. Even getting something like a hack squat, like I don't think there's literally a hack squat in Kerry. There's definitely not one in Killarney. Oh, actually there was one that we got recently. But the point being there, that you don't have this luxury of all these different.
If they have a juicy machine, give them a shout out, you scumbag.
Peak Performance in Killarney got a new hack squat, because they had a squat, a kind of a hack squat type thing, but it wasn't great. The owner knew that, Bobby. But yeah, there you go. Point being that you don't always have the selection of equipment that you may like. So you have to factor that in to your programming decisions. Like if you don't have 6 different chest machines, you can't do six chest exercises. Like, sure, you could do a flat dumbbell press at 15 degree, 30 degree, but it's not always the same thing. So yeah, a lot of these training decisions are made to make you enjoy your training, to be adherent, to feel motivated psychologically. And then there are many things that can contribute to that. So you have to ask what that means for your own training, as opposed to just trying to copy the training of others.
That's perfect. I don't think I have anything else to add to this overall discussion. So do you think that covers everything? Well, probably realistically it doesn't cover everything, but it covers everything that we're willing to discuss in however long this podcast took us, an hour and a half or whatever.
Yeah, basically we repeated everything that we said in the last podcast. So 75% of this podcast you probably heard already. So that's fine. Basically, point being, in summary, if I was to summarize this podcast, what I would say is that failure is not a very clear thing that we can always define. It's going to change between exercises, between individuals, across the training career, and across a given workout. Okay, so what causes you to fail is not always the same, and how we would actually define failure specifically, and whether it's technical or whether it's like truly muscular or whatever, that's going to change. We don't always know what that means for training outcomes. Like, I don't know. Like, if anyone has a really hard stance in terms of saying that training to failure is way better or not training to failure is way better, you couldn't have gotten that understanding from somewhere reliable, because if you read the research on these topics, the study designs vary, sometimes conflicting results, and it's sometimes hard to reconcile some studies with others and some studies with the real world. So that is why we're trying to have a discussion that is very much practical in nature, and why we're trying to reinforce that point that you do actually have to measure the progress you're making. Like, that's the goal. The goal of listening to these podcasts about training is so that you get better. And that's all that matters. So like, that's what you have to do. As a trainer, you have to try and take, the way like me and Paddy are always talking in an agnostic manner. And what we're trying to get across is that there's no one way. And that's really important as a trainer, more so than as an individual for your own training, because you're working with different people and different people are going to respond in different ways. And sometimes what happens is that if you're so invested in one particular approach, you might get results with 50% of your clients, let's say, and then they're the ones that you kind of keep in your mind all the time. And it's a form of survivorship bias. It's the equivalent to if you had a sample of 30 people in a research study, 15 people finished the study, and you ignore the other 15, that gives you a biased sample and a biased understanding. So you can also apply that to the real world. And then in terms of these set strategies, I wouldn't say there's any best necessarily. There are different ways of going about things. You have to consider the practical considerations in terms of your training environment, where you train, what you have available. But you also have to consider what sort of ancillary goals you have. So are you just here for hypertrophy, or are you here for strength as well? Or maybe you're here for some like power adaptations or high velocity strength, you could say. We often forget that there's individuals that have athletic goals. So it could be the case that you do your first 2 sets of a squat exercise jumping, or with doing sets of 3 with 40% of your 1 rep max for high velocity strength adaptations, and then you follow up with different set structures. So point being, there are many options, and you have to you have to analyze it on an individual basis and see what you actually enjoy. Like ultimately the name of the game is consistency and time, and you have to be able to stay in the game and show up every time and be interested. And if you can stay interested in your training, like that is half the battle right there.
Yeah, and this also goes into the thing is that a lot of people, especially even in this discussion, when we're discussing this is assuming that all you are doing is resistance training. And
Yep.
even though, yeah, we're using, strategies and we're talking about, maybe if you have work considerations and whatever else, the fact remains is like, if you are doing a sport and you are training to failure in the gym, that's probably going to negatively affect your ability to train your sport specific stuff later on in the day or in the week, And so while it might represent a good strategy in some instances, like for example, strength, maybe you're like, oh, I want to get stronger in the 3 rep range and the 12 rep range. So this reverse pyramid style training makes sense to me. You have to remember as well, it's like, okay, well, like if I personally, again, using my bias, like I personally like training myself in a reverse pyramid style approach. I like just going in there mentally, clicking into gear, just doing a fucking heavy set, and I'm like, that's the only heavy set that I have to do, and then reducing the weight and doing a higher rep set, more of a pump set or metabolically challenging set. I'm like, I like that approach. I fucking love that. However, it would be physically impossible for me to recover from that to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu later in the day, because that's what I do. I train resistance training in the morning and then do my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the evening. So it's physically impossible for me to recover in that length of time. If I was only training once every 24 hours, cool, I can fucking train as hard as I fucking possibly wanted to. But if I'm training twice every 24 hours and both of these sessions are potentially very demanding, then your training approach has to reflect that.
Yes, sir. And that is the end of this podcast.
Yes, because I'm starving, and Laura is clearly giving you the evil eyes over there going like, Gary, get off that podcast.
She's actually not. She's being very kind and supportive and trying not to make noise.
Oh.
No, she's being respectful and just trying not to make noise. So respect to Laura. Shout out to both of our Lauras in this episode of the podcast for being eternally supportive of me and Patrick's pursuits. So there you go. To end this podcast, of course, you can engage with our usual services listed below in the description box. You'll find our newsletter, the Triage Method newsletter. That's where you'll find all the content we've posted across the week. These podcasts, our YouTube videos, any articles we're sharing or resharing. One of the things actually I meant to bring up was something my clients asked about, is that every week we share like an article that we've written, but we've written it in the past. But the point being there that we're trying to share them in one, a logical sequence, but also we very regularly update things. So one example would be, at the moment we're updating a lot of terminology pages. So when we're going through our articles, then we have written terminology that describes like in more detail what we're talking about. Similarly, if there's new research that comes out that I think is like, oh God, that actually really influences one of the points I made in my article before, I'll go back and change it. So those little tweaks are happening all the time. So that's why it's sometimes useful to have a look at those articles, even if you think you may have seen it before. So yeah, that's that. And also in that newsletter, we send out recommended resources that we think are helpful. So if you are interested in maybe staying on the edge of like maybe new research that has come out that might be influential, like generally like what I do, and I know Patty does the same, is that I get a PubMed alert. Like I think mine's set to daily, but I don't look at it every day. But then I just screen through, and if there's anything useful, I'm like, oh, cool. Huh?
Absolutely reckless.
I know it's like fucking 40 studies a day, but I just look through, and then if I think anything is useful, I'll save it for later. A lot of the time I'll click into research papers. I'm like, yeah, this changes nothing. I have no interest in whether like, I don't know, training to failure versus not training to failure on a leg extension in a sample size of 8 with older women. Does that change their C-reactive protein concentration? like that's just not something I care about, So like we're always kind of screening. So if something does go out to the newsletter, it's because we think it either might change something in practice or it will make you think about things. And that's something that's really important. I don't always necessarily agree with the articles I share in the newsletter. If you go through the book recommendations, some of them I'm like, yeah, I definitely don't agree with everything that's in that book, but it's useful to think about. But yeah, that's the Triage Method newsletter, Triage Method community. Join the Facebook group. That's where you can interact.
On the community thing as well. Like, first of all, like whenever I listen to podcasts and they're talking about a topic, or even if I listen to books and they're talking about a topic that I'm like, I feel I know a lot about, right? I always get triggered when I'm like, I actually want to be part of this conversation, you know? I'm like, oh, I have a point to add to this, or, oh, I could, you know, that was actually wrong. They should have said this, or this is a good analogy, or whatever. I'm like, that's what you can do in the Facebook community, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
you're like, oh, I listened to the Joe Rogan podcast and I feel I would be a great contributor to the conversation they had around fucking, I don't know, magic mushrooms or something. It's like, they don't have a fucking Facebook group where you can interact with Joe and be like, oh, you said this wrong, blah, blah, blah. We do. We have a community where you're like, if you say, oh, this is bullshit, what you said here is retarded and you're stupid and whatever. I don't care if you literally fucking slate us and you have a well-researched point of view. Like, I'd love to see that in the Facebook group so we can actually have a discussion and we can put out better content, you know, because realistically, there's no way that two individuals can know everything there is to know. You know, there's simply not enough time in the universe to do this, you know. And so if you do have points and you're like, oh man, I wish I could put that into somewhere, I wish I could tell them that they're wrong on that, or I really like that point and that's really helped me think of something, that community is where you go for that. So if you get triggered, like I get triggered listening to podcasts, then that's the place to go to voice your concerns or your triggeredness.
Yeah, and it also helps us because, like, I don't want to be stupid and wrong. Like, so if there's something I'm stupid and wrong about, like, please tell me. Like, I always think that's just the worst, most weak, like, lack of courage ever, when you're afraid to comment on someone's post that is wrong or tell them that they're actually wrong, because especially if you care about the person, like, it's not actually, you're not a nice person if you tell someone they're right all the time. Like, you actually don't care about that person. You're just trying to make them feel good. You care about someone, you tell them they're dumb as fuck. Like, that's just, you're like, here, man, like, you do not know what you're talking about. Like, me and Paddy do that all the time. Like, he's absolutely thick as shit. But anyway, on to the rest of the recommendations, so we don't make this 2 hours. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. New stuff going up there all the time. I don't really care if you subscribe to our Facebook or Twitter, because once you do same with our Instagram, like, once you kind of are on the newsletter or you join the Triage Method community, you can keep in contact with us. But I mean, it's always nice to see our
You should follow us on YouTube, because
yes, definitely on YouTube. Yeah. And like, sometimes, like, it's kind of hard to deliver YouTube content on other platforms. So if you're subscribed and you get the notifications and you see it coming up, that's fantastic. And yeah, of course, our services, you can engage with group coaching. There, you will have a discount with New Year 10, all one word, for the male or female group coaching. Both options are followed by their respective leaders. That was an awful way of saying that. You leaders, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I am Jesus. Basically, what I was trying to say there is that I'm actually currently following the male group programming, and Bree is following the female group programming, and we wouldn't be following those programs if we didn't believe in them. So there you go. And yeah, I think they're really useful. The current male program, I'm actually loving it. I wrote it, obviously, on bias, but it's pretty fun. You know, it's a more strength focused program this month. So if you'd like to join, like, you can basically join whenever you want, and if you join at the crossover of a month, let's say you join on week 4 of a program, it doesn't really matter, because you can just transition into the next phase, and maybe you could save the previous phase for another time, or you could also just follow that month from the get-go, like, and just keep it going. But I mean, you ultimately have that freedom. Like, I don't really care what you do, you know. We're here to give you accountability and make sure you progress. So if you want to join the group, engage in the group and let us help you. So one-to-one coaching available, as always, if you'd like to work with me and Paddy one-on-one individually with a far more personalized touch. That is a good way to do that. And then finally, we've got our program templates there to inspire, to give you an idea of what you should be looking for, not to tell you exactly what to do forever for the rest of your life, but it is a good way of learning about programming theory and seeing how it applies in practice. We will be bringing out more specific programming ebooks in the future, so do look out for those, because I think people are interested in kind of like body parts and specialization and like a deadlift program and all that sort of stuff. So we'll get there.
If Gary gets his finger out, we might have a big project coming later in the year for something around that, but that's under wraps, top secret. It involves Gary
going to Mars and building a gym, bitch.
It involves Gary actually doing work, and he's not great at that.
I'm a thinker. I'm I'm a professional. I saw my friend, or Lyndon, that was on the podcast before. In his bio, he's just like a aspiring professional thinker. Like, I like that. Like, I just want to, sit in a cave, just think,
Fair.
do nothing.
Yeah, so I'm really hungry right now, so we're gonna wrap this up, and I'm gonna eat. And don't
Yeah, same.
that is actually terrifying, Gary. Um,
I look at Mark Bell.
you do actually not. Um, but anyway, we're gonna wrap this up. I've nothing else to add, Gary. Do you have anything else to add?
Nothing else to add, lads. It's too easy. Go on, you absolute mad lad.
XO, XO.